Welcome to the Thoughtful Leader podcast. My name is Ben Brearley. I'm a leadership coach and the founder of Thoughtful Leader. The Thoughtful Leader podcast is all about short, sharp leadership advice because thoughtful leadership is good leadership. Welcome to episode 248 of the Thoughtful Leader podcast. In this episode, I'm going to tackle the important question, are you picking your battles or are you actually avoiding something that's important to you? And what I mean by that is a lot of people say you should pick your battles and then they choose the battles that are easiest for them to overcome rather than the real interesting ones that they probably should be focusing on. So I'm going to help you decide whether you're avoiding or actually just being discerning about the battles you choose. Okay, let's get into the episode right now. So many workplaces are full of issues and challenges that need to be solved or overcome. Now, I think generally some good advice is that you need to pick your battles. That is, you need to decide which issues are worth fighting for and which you should let go of. After all, we only have so much time and attention, so it's counterproductive to try to tackle every challenge at once. So which is it? Are you avoiding something or are you just sensibly picking your battles? Now, the challenge with the advice of picking your battles is that it sometimes gives us an out. We can simply say we're choosing to overlook this problem or that problem because there are bigger things to worry about, bigger fish to fry. Now, I can feel a palpable sense of relief when someone convinces themselves that there are more important things they can focus on. So the trick is to identify whether this is true or just an illusion we create to protect ourselves. Now, one way I see this appearing is that some leaders tend to bury their heads in the work rather than the surrounding people problems that are making the work more difficult. So the aim of this episode is to provide some simple guidelines to highlight when you might actually be picking your battles wisely, or if instead you may be heading down the path of avoidance. There's a related article you might find useful about avoiding conflict. Here's what's really happening. I'll put that in the show notes page, which for today is thoughtfulleader.com/248. Okay, so it's important to ask the question, why do leaders avoid tackling certain problems? I've noticed avoidance cropping up often in workplaces, so it's worth looking at why this might be. And the first and fairly obvious reason is because tackling certain problems is uncomfortable. It's much nicer to avoid discomfort so we can feel better about ourselves and the situation. The obvious problem with this approach is that the challenge may not go away and may even get worse. So second, we may be optimistic by nature, and this tendency is referred to as optimism bias, and it means that we may mistakenly believe that things will turn out well for us, even if there is evidence to the contrary. So being optimistic obviously can be positive. It's what keeps us believing we can do great things and overcome our challenges, but it can also provide us with a positivity blanket that can prevent us from taking action. And you might find yourself saying, well, I'm sure it'll sort itself out. And if you find yourself saying that, that can be a challenge. And there's a related article that you might find useful. Is optimism bias sabotaging your leadership? Check that out in the show notes page. Now, lastly, I think a major reason for failing to tackle issues is the nature of the problem itself. So there's a leadership theory called adaptive leadership theory, which tells us that there are adaptive challenges and technical challenges. Technical challenges are those that can be solved with a technical solution with facts and logic. Adaptive challenges tend to be trickier, involving changing behavior and tackling the status quo and existing ways of working. They don't have a concrete solution and therefore can involve a significant degree of uncertainty. Now, the uncertainty around these problems tends to lead to procrastination. After all, it's hard to feel confident about solving a problem when there is no clear technical solution. While technical challenges may still be complex to solve, their solution lies in being able to harness knowledge and turn it into action. Adaptive challenges, on the other hand, often involve grey areas that need consistent effort and there's no simple fix. So couple the uncertainty of a challenge with optimism bias and you have a potent source of avoidance. So nobody can tell you for sure that it won't sort itself out, can they? So picking your battles is smart, but not when used as an excuse to avoid tackling real issues. So let's look at some potential guidelines to try to tell whether we are simply letting ourselves off the hook or whether we are justified in overlooking the issue at hand. So the first thing I'd recommend is to look for a recurring pattern. I sometimes work with coaching clients who are considering leaving their jobs. Now, if you have a bad boss or are working in a difficult environment and are simply not enjoying your role, then this, of course, is a valid potential option. However, many of my clients also notice that even if they quit, they are not really solving their problem for the long term. The issue may reappear and become a recurring theme in their work and their lives. Now, the trick is to look for a recurring pattern. A recurring pattern might show up as making multiple similar decisions that tend to have a poor outcome, or maybe there's a familiar people problem that you notice yourself having again and again, or maybe you're facing the same sorts of challenge multiple times. Now, if you find that you are facing a recurring pattern, it might be that avoidance is not helping with the root cause of the problem. Otherwise, you might simply find yourself staring at this problem again in a different form in the future. Now, the second thing I'd recommend is to look for signs of resistance. A temptation to avoid is often found where there is resistance. And by resistance, I mean the uncomfortable feeling that we don't want to do something. We may feel it as fear, anxiety, or frustration. Now, the topic of resistance is covered extensively in the book The War of Art, which I'll put a link to in the show notes page, which is worth a read. And by the way, it's not really an arty book, as the title says. It's actually a good read, so check that one out. Now, as the book suggests, sometimes tackling resistance is exactly what we need to grow the most. So if that difficult conversation, aggressive person, or frustrating team member is getting you down, it might be that engaging with them more closely is exactly what you need to do. Now, the final thing I'll suggest here is to look at the language of control. One of my favorite simple tools is the sphere of control from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Now, it comprises 3 spheres, which are control, influence, and concern. Things in our sphere of concern tend to worry us, and we may spend time thinking about them, but they are out of our direct control. The spheres of control and influence, on the other hand, contain those things we can actively do to influence our situation or control it directly. For example, we can have a conversation with our boss to persuade them of our point of view about something. So the conversation that we initiate with our boss is in our direct control. To persuading the boss is in our influence. We can't tell the boss what to do directly, but we can influence them to maybe make a decision that's in our favor. So picking your battle starts in the areas that we can control and influence. So the question I'd like to ask you here is, are you operating in the wrong sphere? Now, the sphere of control is a very useful tool until we convince ourselves that things are in the wrong sphere. So some of this type of language tends to give it away for me. When people say things like, they'd never listen to me, or they've made up their mind, or it wouldn't make a difference, or it would have happened anyway, or perhaps I can't do anything about that. Now, if you notice yourself falling prey to this sort of language, it's worth stopping to ask yourself, are these statements really true, or are they being used as an excuse? Because what we're actually doing is convincing ourselves that things are out of our control, and we give ourselves a reason to give up and to stop trying. And sometimes this can have us sitting in victim mode, which is a very helpless place to be. And there's a related article you might find useful about having a victim leadership mentality. You can check that out on the show notes page, thoughtfulleader.com/248. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that everything is in your control and that every battle is worth fighting, but I do find that fear and resistance can have us shying away from challenges that might actually be worth solving. In fact, they might be exactly the challenges that will bring us the biggest benefits. So it's worth taking time to reflect on your challenges and whether there is justified avoidance, or whether the avoidance is simply an excuse to make life feel a little easier in the short term. So, have you noticed any other factors which have you shying away from tackling your challenges? I'd love to hear about them. You can leave a comment on the show notes page, thoughtfulleader.com/248. And on your podcast app of choice, if you can hit the like or subscribe button, it would really be valuable to me. I appreciate it in advance because it helps me build the audience of Thoughtful Leader and get the word out about the podcast. Okay, so thank you for listening to this episode. Keep up the thoughtful leadership, and I'll be back next week.